1675. Armed conflict in the Massachusetts Bay Colony breaks out between New England's colonists and the local Wampanoag Native American tribes. This was a quick and brutal war. It came to its conclusion in 1678, only 3 years after it began. Still, this war should not be discounted, as within those 3 years, it quickly became the most lethal war to ever occur on American soil, relative to population size. Entire towns and villages were destroyed, families were broken, and all involved in the war took decades to recover once the conflict had ended. Today, this conflict goes by many different names, but the one we will be using is King Philip's War. When the Plymouth colony was established in 1620, the settlement's success was largely due to the aid of the sachem, or head chief, of the Pokanoket Nation, Massasoit Osamakeen. It was within these formative years that the personal bonds of peace between the first generation of settlers and Native Americans were created. This was a fragile peace, however, and the two cultures' opposing ways of life, coupled with the colonists' never-ending urge to expand, had been cause for endless tension. When Sachem Massasoit died in 1657 and his son Massasoit Alexander followed in 1662, Metacom, Alexander's brother, known to the English as Philip, became the new sachem of Pokanoket Nation. With Philip's rise to chiefdom, the personal bonds previously maintaining peace between the two groups were now shattered. The first in a sequence of actions to invoke open violence between the Native Americans and New England colonists occurred in 1662. Massasoit Alexander was led at gunpoint by colonial militiamen to the marshaled home of Josiah Winslow, where it was expected that he engaged in peace negotiations. Shortly after leaving the military commander's house, Alexander sickened, collapsed, and died. Metacom, who was now sachem of the Pokanoket, suspected that the colonists had murdered Alexander. In 1671, the English demanded that Massasoit and Metacom sign a peace treaty that would require the Wampanoag tribe to surrender their arms. On January 29, 1675, the peace between the two groups began to crumble. John Sassamon, a Native American Christian convert, as well as Metacom's advisor, was murdered by 3 Wampanoag tribesmen. Sassamon was purportedly murdered at Metacom's behest. He was angered when Sassamon told the colonists about Wampanoag plans to assault colonial settlements. On June 8, 1675, the 3 tribesmen were executed. This outcome enraged the Native Americans, who viewed the trial as an insult to their sovereignty. As a result, on June 20, 1675, the colonial town of Swansea was raided by a band of Pokanoket, and King Philip's War officially began. After the attack on the border town of Swansea, the Wampanoag were joined by the Nipmuc, Narragansett, and Podunk tribes. In response, all the New England colonies became involved in the war and sought aid from the English crown. Unfortunately for them, no help had come from their government. The war was largely fought using guerrilla tactics, but despite that, large-scale battles still had a huge impact on the outcome of the war. King Philip and his allies enjoyed early success in these conflicts, with victories such as the one at the Battle of Bloody Brook on September 18, 1675. Metacom's forces continued this momentum, and by the spring of 1676, the long arm of King Philip and his allies reached as far as the Plymouth plantation itself. Luckily for the colonists, the Native Americans' March 12th raid had failed to destroy the Plymouth colony. Unfortunately for the Native Americans, this was a war of attrition, and the colonists used the numbers and supplies to turn the tide of the war by spring of 1676. To further worsen matters for the Native Americans, on January 1676, Metacom made a long journey west and attempted to secure an alliance with the Mohawk tribe. This effort backfired, and Metacom's forces soon found that the Mohawk tribe was amongst their enemies. By April of that year, Canonchet, the Narragansett's chief, was killed, and the Narragansett were utterly defeated. Over time, the Wampanoag and Nipmuc were subdued by the colonists' constant assaults. On August 1676, John Alderman, a so-called praying Indian, struck an important blow for the colonists at Mount Hope, Rhode Island, when he shot and killed Metacom. Despite Metacom's death, the warring in northern New England did not end until April 12, 1678. And the Treaty of Casco was signed in Maine by the remaining combatants in the area. King Philip's War was extremely devastating, the aftermath of which would permanently change the lives of everyone involved. 15% of the local native population died. Entire Native American families were sold into slavery abroad. Others were forced into serving the local colonists. And all Wampanoags lost political independence in Massachusetts. 800 out of 52,000 colonists died, and relative to population size, this was a death rate that was nearly twice that in the Civil War. It took Massachusetts colonists decades to recover from the massive loss of life, pervasive property damage, and rampant military expenditures that were incurred during the war. However, despite the destructiveness of King Philip's War, life did continue afterwards. Native Americans who refrained from participating in hostilities continued to live in Massachusetts, and many maintained tribal ties and a strong sense of community. For the colonists, the war had been won, and they set up on the road to recovery, and eventually began to colonize the land they so bitterly fought over. The fact that New Englanders achieved this victory without any help from the English crown is also important to the colonists in ways that cannot be ignored. The self-won war the colonists fought imbued them with a sense of independence, and in their minds, it helped to separate themselves and their colony from the English Empire.